I am delighted to be moderating this very important session on writing and race. On the stage with me are Kayo Chingonyi and Nikesh Shukla, two writers who have recently been in the news for some very, very exciting reasons. Kayo, just about 2 weeks ago, won the Swansea University International Dylan Thomas Prize for his poetry collection, Kumukanda. I have to say this, sorry, this £30,000 prize is the richest prize for young writers in the world. And I mean, besides this, Kayo has also been awarded the Jeffrey Dreamer Prize. He's been shortlisted for the Costa Prize and the Chaluk Prize, all for this book, right? Lovely. Kayo is a poetry editor for The White Review and an assistant professor at Durham University. To my left is Nikesh Shukla. His third novel, The One Who Wrote Destiny, was just published in April to wide acclaim. Nikesh's debut novel, Coconut Unlimited, was shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award and longlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize. Nikesh is also the editor of The Good Immigrant, in which 21 British writers of color discuss race and immigration in the UK. Nikesh, let's start with the book. I stayed up for the better part of the night reading it. It's unputdownable, and every one of you should buy a copy of it once the session's done. Nikesh will be available to sign it, okay? Your book traces the fortunes of 3 generations of the Johnny family. You know, there's Mukesh, who comes in from Kenya in the 1960s, settles down in Yorkshire, and his children, the twins Neha and Rakesh, and their grandmother. You tackle issues of immigration and race. You know, there's the overt racism that we see in Mukesh's life. I mean, you know, the minute he lands in England, there's, you know, someone shouts bloody war at him, someone hurls a brick at him. There's also a mob, you know, a racist mob that breaks out at a festival. And before I give too much away, you know, there's also a murder brought about by racism. The twins who live in present-day England encounter racism too, but the racism they encounter is nothing like what Mukesh and Mukesh's father-in-law encountered. Was capturing the changing face of racism in Britain one of your intentions when you wrote the book?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that thing. I wanted to have an intergenerational conversation with my father because, you know, so interestingly enough, I was sitting on this stage 2 years ago with Mike Williams and Vani Capaldio talking about issues around the Good Immigrant, and Mike Williams was talking about what he felt was playground racism, which is, you know, what he referred to microaggressions and issues around, you know, what we call institutional systemic racism. And I found it quite patronizing, actually. But because what he was saying kind of echoed the conversations I had with my dad. So my dad came over in the 60s, and, you know, my dad nearly died in the 60s. He was attacked by some NF members, and that one of them broke a glass bottle over his head and he nearly bled to death, but, you know, thankfully he's still alive. But to him, that was racism. And so when I'd come home upset that people were making fun of me for where I came from and not who I was, that to him, he always referred to that as Mickey Mouse racism. And, you know, it was things like Brexit that kind of helped us to kind of come to some sort of understanding that, you know, there is a scale for these things. And just because he was at the coalface of like some really visceral things, you know, he was in England in the era of the no blacks, no dogs, no Irish signs outside pubs. That didn't mean that those things had gone away. And it was a conversation that we were having with my uncle, so my uncle was the first person in our family to come over in 1962. And in '68, he tried to buy a house in Huddersfield. He ended up in Keighley because he couldn't find lodgings. So he tried to buy a house in 1968 in Huddersfield, and the housing company refused to sell the house to him because they wouldn't sell to coloureds, because they didn't want to devalue the area. And my uncle said, did you know that's now illegal, because the Race Relations Act had just come in 1968, and my uncle was the first person in the history of the British legal system to bring a case of racial discrimination under the Race Relations Act. But my uncle, because it was a test case, it was thrown out of court on a technicality, but the judge said in his dismissal judgment that discrimination had taken place. And so, you know, these conversations around how much things have changed, have been happening for years and years in my family. And in 2016, 2017, there was this news story about a landlord who refused to rent properties out to South Asians in Kent because he didn't want his properties to stink of curry. And so we were talking about this, and we were talking about my uncle's case, and we started to kind of come to terms with the fact that this intergenerational conversation needed to be had, and and then it all goes down on the page, because that's what you do as a writer.
Wow. Your book begins with this sentence: I have no reason to be anywhere. I'm very, very intrigued by that sentence. Could you tell us a little bit about it? Is that yeah, please tell us something about it. Yeah.
Well, so I wanted to write a book about immigration that sort of took a sidestep away from conversations around refugees and asylum seekers, because obviously those are very specific stories that have their own reasons and circumstances. And I wanted to write about an immigrant family that kind of coincidence takes them on a journey. Coincidence takes them to Keighley. Coincidence takes them back down to London. Coincidence puts him on the same street as the future love of his life, and all the rest of it. And so I wanted to write about the kind of the precarious nature of a generation of immigrants like my dad, who moved to the UK seeking fortune, but either didn't find it or didn't end up where they thought they were going to end up, and it wasn't through any reason. It was just through circumstance, and the role of circumstance and destiny play out quite a lot in the novel.
Excellent, Nikesh. I would love for you to read an extract from the book, just to give the audience a taste of how amazing it is.
Oh, thank you. I'll read two bits. I'll read a short bit from the start of the novel, featuring Mukesh in Keighley in 1966, and then I'll read a short section from present day. I have no reason to be anywhere. I find myself in an in-between world with no purpose except to lean with my back against the wall across the road from Nisha's Ami and Papa's house. Not like a stalker, no. Instead, I am posed like the poet I am, my pen poised to make ink marks and etchings on an open notebook page. So far, all I have written is Nisha's name. Her first name, her full name, her first name with my surname, my first name with her surname, our names together. I write the openings of poems, but I never get past the first word of the first line. I have never written a poem before. I know that the first line starts with the word Nisha. Despite my lack of experience as a writer, her very existence inspires me. Nisha means night. Maybe there's something in this for me to spin into poetry. Nisha, tonight, you are night. I wear my best clothes because they're all I have that isn't my white pajama lenga or my exercise shorts. And now that I'm not in school, I don't need to subject myself to the level of humiliation that comes with wearing short shorts. The damp breeze reminds me that I'm alone in England, in a navy blue suit jacket that used to belong to my father, which I cannot button up. Ummi tried to find me blue trousers that matched it, but failed. In the grey of Keighley, the difference between the two is extremely noticeable. I have two white shirts, which, due to the climate, I can wear all day, every day, as there's never any chance of getting hot enough to stain the collar. I look down at my father's black tie, thin with a pin that bears his name in Gujarati, Rakesh. I wonder what has happened to my wardrobe now that I'm here. Ummi has probably given everything to my younger brother, because why take clothes invented for hotter climates to the wet and grey of England's green and pleasant land? Nisha, Are you my destiny? I glance at my watch again, my father's watch. Everything I own is my father's. I have to preserve these heirlooms to pass on. Until then, I am the head of the family and thus inherit all his fancy items. The watch says 5:30 p.m. on the nose. The British have funny expressions for things. 5:30 p.m. on the nose. Everything has a nose. Everything has human features and human responses. They didn't teach me this in school. I learnt about verb conjugations, vocabulary, pronouns, adjectives, adverbs. I was never taught vernacular, slang. The entire English language is composed of idioms. I feel lost most days when overhearing conversations at breakfast between the owners of the house where I lodge. I never say anything. They assume it's because I speak no English. Actually, it's because I do not speak their version of English. And now I'm going to flip forward to present day. So Mukesh, his life turns out all right, or maybe it doesn't, and he has some kids. We have to read the book to find out. And one of his kids is called Rakesh, and Rakesh is a stand-up comedian in present day England, and he's sort of travelling the world as his career is in its ascendancy, and each section of Rakesh's is told from the perspective of someone he meets. And so he has just met Raki, who is a barista in New York, and the section is called All Cassavas Have the Same Skin, but Not All Taste the Same, and I'm not going to do an American accent. The first time he comes in, he lectures me about our menu, telling me that calling it a chai tea latte is cultural misappropriation. I smile thinking he's joking, but then he launches into a whole comedy routine about it, and I'm like, dude, I just work here. You know, chai tea latte is a redundant phrase, right? He says. He's from London. He might think that over here we're all going to be fawning over his accent, but no chance, buddy. It's cultural misappropriation. Chai means tea, right? So you're pretty much serving tea, like tea-flavoured tea. I'd like some tea. What flavour, sir? Tea-flavoured tea, please. And anyway, seeing as you mean masala chai, not chai, so I guess a spiced tea. You know it's made with mostly milk, right? Half milk, half water probably, or if you're really luxurious, all milk all day. So having a masala chai latte is redundant because it's already made with milk. What are you going to do? Add milk to the tea-flavoured tea that's made with milk? Delicious. I can't help but smile at him committing to the bit. He really wants to own this moment. And what can I get you, I ask. I'd like an Americano coffee, please, he says, laughing. Surely if it's American, you guys should just call it an American coffee, right? Or just coffee? One Americano, I call out. Would you like it in or out? In, please. For here, I shout. Behind me, I can feel Maggie pretending I'm invisible, so I call it out a second time. I fucking heard you, I hear her mutter. I take the payment and carry on serving. Serving's better than the alternatives. If there's no customers, there's the code of the barista. If you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean. I watch this guy sit in the window and stare outside. He has brought a magazine, but he doesn't touch it. He's got his phone on the table, but he doesn't touch it. He goes into a deep stare with the sidewalk outside, watching the borough throb. The second time he comes in, he orders his Americano. He's quieter, less showy. Sorry for being an asshole yesterday, he tells me. I shake my head. I fed your feedback to the owner. Wait, can you feed feedback? I ask. I think you just feed back, he says. No, but I was feeding back your feedback. So you fed back to the owner that I had commented. Wait, no, because you had feedback that I relayed. Yes, I relayed your feedback to the owner, I say. And? He thinks you're an asshole, I say, laughing. That's fair. I think you're fine. You're okay. Americano, or as the Americans call it, coffee? Please, thank you. Can I have it to go? Sure, I say. No people watching today? He doesn't reply. A call comes through on his phone and he takes it, listening intently as he pays, juggling with phone, change and wallet, and goes to wait for Maggie, the slow ass, to pour him a fucking coffee. The next customer tries to give me his number. I decline it. He drops it into the tip jar anyway, winking at me. The third time he comes in, he asks if I want to get a cup of coffee sometime. Or, he says, maybe something different. You're probably sick of coffee, right? What about bows? I could really go for some bows. Do you like bows? Bows are fine, I say, laughing. I look around. Maggie's listening. The coffee has a strict no fraternization policy. I think it's because some bigwig hotshot bullshit whatever's come here and they've said to the owner that people keep slipping them their manuscripts. And they're just like, I just want to drink my one-drop vanilla macchiato spiced pumpkin latte in peace. I get off at 7, I say quietly. He nods and mouths, 1:15 out front. I smile. I get asked out for a date every single day. Look, it's tough being Indian in the most hipster part of this borough. Well, I remember a guy who said namaste when I walked past a yoga studio. I was like, what, guy, what? You just want to say hello to me? Say hello. Don't think you're being all spiritual just because you do yoga. I was carrying a tiffin filled with my lunch, 4 layers, dal bhat chak rotli, and I think he thought, oh look, a Desi girl with a spiritual food carrier. How exotic and quaint. Fuck you, buddy. It keeps things separate. It's practical. And when I come home late at night, it makes me feel safe to know that I'm carrying steel with sharp edges. It's not exotic. It's daily life. My dad took one of these to work with him every single day. He told me once that a security guard searched it for a bomb. He worked at that same hospital for 30 years and they still treated him like a terrorist. I wore a kurti one day and people said, oh, is it Diwali? And I was like, Mr. Mayonnaise, please. It's 90 degrees outside. You think I want to wear a synthetic T-shirt or do I want to wear breathable cotton? But this guy, this British Desi guy, he seems okay. Plus he's right about the chai tea latte thing. I looked it up.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you. Kayo, could you tell us a bit about how this very sublime collection of poetry came about?
Lots of the poems in it were begun in 2013. I went on a writing retreat to a place called Cove Park on the west of Scotland. I spent 5 weeks there, and some of what this collection became came into focus as I was there. I was there with a novelist, someone who's a composer, someone else who wrote kind of folk songs, someone who draws stuff, and then just being in the company of different kinds of artists, all of whom were kind of working on something. It gave me this sense of kind of pressure. What is this thing that I've been leading up to, this collection? At that point, I had a small pamphlet out already, and I started to think about what I would want to put in a full-length collection of poetry if, like, I only ever had the chance to do one. And then I started to think about the idea of initiation, the idea of moving across a threshold into something else, which I think somebody's first full-length collection or their debut novel or their first book of any kind is that kind of initiation into the world of authorship proper. So the word Kumukanda came to my mind because it's a word from the Luvali language, which is one of the languages that is in my family. It's from the my dad's side of the family. And I started thinking about this word, and I would speak quite a lot with my aunt about different things from Zambia in order to kind of populate my work with a kind of knowledge of the place that I had been away from for a long time. And she was talking to me about this word in particular, and I was like, I might call my full-length collection that, and she was like, oh, don't call it that. And
why?
because
Why did she not want you to call it that?
I don't know. She had this notion that well, it's a very specific word. And like that specificity can be a hindrance in some sense. There's a sense of having to teach people how to pronounce it, having to tell people what it means, and that kind of thing. But for me, that's what opened up something really special about the word and the title. And so when she said that, and then subsequently when my my editor, after the book had been bought, said about this title, I was like, no, we're keeping the title. At that point, it had been 3 years with the same title, and so the book really started to take shape in that summer that I was away for 5 weeks. I had this title, I had this theme, and I had some sporadic poems towards that theme, and then some others that didn't fit. And the next 3 years were spent trying to make this collection whole and trying to fill in the gaps and trying to write all of the poems that would make up the collection and make it feel full. And then the hardest one was the title poem, which took a long time. Almost didn't make it into the manuscript in time, but it did.
Why?
Just about. I just wasn't happy enough with it, basically. But we got to the point just before we had to print the book, and I was like, okay, how about this version? I think I like this version. And they were like, yes, we like the previous version, but this one is, this one is actually, yeah, I think you've got. So yeah, it was a 3-year kind of period where the poems really crystallized after some very deep thinking on that retreat.
Lovely. I would love for you to read Kumukanda, the poem, and any other poems you want. But I think Kumukanda is one of the strongest poems there, and it's.
Yeah, it has this curious capacity to hold some of the themes of the book as a whole, which is probably emblematic of the fact that it was written last, actually. But yeah, I'm still happy with it, which doesn't normally happen after you've been with some work for a while. Kumukanda. So the word means initiation, if that wasn't clear. Since I haven't danced among my fellow initiates, following a looped procession from woods at the edge of a village, Tatter's people would think me unfinished, a child who never sloughed off the childish estate. To cross the river, boys of our tribe must cross in order to die and come back grown. I was raised in a strange land by small increments. When I bathed my mother the days she was too weak. When Auntie broke the news and I chose a yellow suit and white shoes to dress my mother's body. At the graveside, when the man I almost grew to call Dad, though we both needed a hug, shook my hand. If my alternate self who never left could see me, what would he make of these literary pretensions? This need to speak with a tongue that isn't mine. Would he be strange to me as I to him, frowning, as he greets me in the language of my father, and my father's father, and my father's father's father? I like to read this poem because it situates me in one of the places that I think of as home, which is Romford Market. So I used to go to school in a place called Harold Hill. I lived for a year in Harold Hill and went to school there. And Harold Hill and Romford were at war with each other. They remain so, to be honest with you. But you can walk from Romford to Harold Hill in like half an hour, 45 minutes. They're, to all intents and purposes, the same place to people from outside. But there's a very particular micro-culture in Harold Hill, which is quite separate from Romford. But there was something about Romford which drew us at the weekend and various times because it was slightly bigger, there was 2 shopping centres there, that kind of thing. So it was part of my kind of, my recreational life, really. And this is a poem that is a celebration of that in some ways. It's called How to Cry. I'm going to fold as an overloaded trestle folds in the middle of Romford Market and bawl the way my small niece bawls for her mother when she leaves the room. In spite of our assurances, already the little one knows that those who leave might never come back. Though I keep God in a small closed box, I'll prostrate myself outside Argos, beat the cobbles with my palm till blood rings in my fingertips. There, amid cockneys selling fish, box fresh from Billingsgate, tears will occur to eyes I thought I'd cried out. I want to be set off by our red brick uni, its array of strange faces. Show me round the flat that stinks of our sleeplessness, plans hatched in the whispers of small hours. I'm tired of this strength. Let me be bereft, watching the white limousine as it drives away. I'll finish with a couple of shorter poems there's a poem towards the end of the book which I'll end with, and this is a poem. This is a poem on naming. Our family is just about to be joined by a new arrival from my cousin and his partner. And in Zambia, we make no distinction between cousins and siblings. So I have a lot of siblings and therefore nephews and nieces. Some of them are all the same age, so there'll be like 10 of them, and they'll just surround you, which is a lot of fun. One of my nieces is called Malaika, and she's 4 years old, and she is about to be joined by a new sibling. And just before she was born, her parents were kind of confused about what she would be called. And they've reached that same state again. They're not very good with names, I don't know. They've been like, okay, so we're casting around for names. And so they asked if we had any suggestions for names, and nobody else gave them any feedback except me. So she ended up being called a name that I had suggested, which I like to sometimes be like, well, you know, I named you. So, you know, Malaika, put that down, I named you. She doesn't really follow that, but what can you do? So this is called Malumbo. Malumbo are kind of, they're celebrations that you would make for somebody when they're born, when they die, at important moments in their life. So this is Malumbo for Malaika. Your parents rejected my suggestion. I told them you could pull off Ethel. The jury is still out. Alicia, out of the question. Ditto Shaniqua and Chantel. I have a soft spot for Dambisa, Malaika, or Mambwe, but whatever you are called, you should know we've all been waiting for your birthday. The look on your face as you apprehend snow. I hope you hold on to your wonder that you will never grow so stiffly poised. A scent or song is not enough to conjure that smile of yours, the fullness of your voice.
Would you also like to recite Garage MC for my sake?
I can't do the whole thing, it's very long. But I'll read some of it, actually.
Some of it.
So I'll just... this comes from the Harold Hill portion of my life, and is a kind of fictionalized account of my time as a garage MC. If you don't know garage, it's like it's a very fast music.
Spelling and counting.
Yeah, there's a lot of spelling out your name in garage, as there was in early hip hop, K to the A to the Y to the O, lots of things like that, which comes into this poem a little bit later. But this is just a part of the poem. My love of garage came out of listening to radio, pirate radio. I was living in southwest London listening to pirate radio, and then we moved to Essex, and I was like, where's my pirate radio gone? But finally I found some stations and could keep up with my love of the music. So this is just a part from Self-Portrait as a garage MC. 117 Retford Road, Harold Hill, Essex. I can't sleep because there are no sirens, no neighbors' screams lulling me to lurid dreams of Natasha Laron. There is no panoramic view for solace, but in the right light this window shows not this white flight satellite town, but South London from 17 floors up. The River Wandle, a coiled snake swallowed by the Thames. Friends crossing the road to the park in my absence, the alley between flats where Sasha blasts a tattered ball into the goal net simulacrum, a wall against which his brother Stacy stands, hands shrouded in goalie gloves. It is our first night in this grieving house. I miss listening to Delight 103.0, and with no tapes to remind me the best bet is Kiss, but they don't play the songs for which my cheap headphones exist. When we pitched up, the neighbors spoke of how the old gal, God rest her soul, wasn't fanned for days. And though the family tidied up for a quick sale, there was a staleness when we prized the door open, its hinges stiff, wood swollen in the late summer heat. If you were to walk the 4.5 miles to Crow Lane, you'd see her name in there, one stone. She fell asleep 3 years after him, and they're dearly loved, sorely missed, but no less gone for that. When all is quiet, I can still hear the sirens through the gaps in the barred windows, still see the power station dusky and unused in a distance that seems to stretch to the edge of everything. The smog in which garage music lives and everybody's got lyrics. I can still hear Peter Biggs saying enter with the East Ender, Peggy with the breast cancer, Tiffany, try mate baby, Mark with the HIV. In Harold Hill, the girls ask if I'm from up London. Smile when I nod like we've come to some understanding. Sensing I have a voice, Mr. Cox tries to make me join the swing band. I say no. I end up singing Living La Vida Loca in midnight blue shades, anyway. For months, the hours before Mum comes home pass in the wake of drive time pop, until flicking through stations one dark afternoon, I hear those click and clack hi-hats and stop on Magic FM.
Did you say there was no resistance from the publishers to calling the book Kumukanda, or?
So, actually, the process was comparatively smooth by comparison with other people I've talked to about the title, the cover, all that kind of stuff. The title was kind of like, there was this consideration from my editor. She was just thinking, well, the process of making a book is about the work that you're creating to begin with, and then when the book is sold, it's about the reader. Mm-hmm. So for readers who've not come across this word, there might be like a little bit of friction, a difficulty. And then I just said, this is the title of the book. And then I think maybe she mentioned it once more to like check if I was still sure. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, I think this is the right title for the book. If I came up with another title, that might be more understandable, but it just wouldn't be the title for this book. And she said, well, yeah, you're probably right about that. And after a while, people will get it. And after that, she was like, actually, yeah, it was always supposed to be this title. So I always was very supported in the things that I wanted for the book. I was just asked questions that came from, it's an industry, I guess, and it's an industry with certain tropes and problems, I suppose. And so I was asked questions from that perspective sometimes. Yeah. And when I pushed back against them, it was not as difficult as I thought it would be. I didn't feel that I was fighting all the time. I was kind of like, oh no, actually no, it has to be like that because that's the way that I conceived of it in the writing process. And they were like, oh, cool. And that was surprising to me, actually. It was good to be listened to in that way in relation to the work.
You have good publishers.
Well, but it's also important to note that your editor is a woman of colour as well. So
yeah, I think my editor is called Parisa Ibrahimi, and in terms of trade publishers who publish poetry, she's the one who's doing the most in terms of expanding the boundaries of British poetry to include everything that is part of the conversation of Britishness at the moment. So I think
this is Harville Secker or
Chatto and Windus, right. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I think what she's done with the poetry list is really go in search of where she can find poetry that speaks to people beyond a very narrow definition of British poetry. And so, of course, that does mean being open to pushback from the authors, and I think that's been to the strength of the list, really. Mm. I think of maybe Sarah Howe's collection, A Loop of Jade. A Loop of Jade is like a wonderful book, but it's not an easy book. It's a very complex, nuanced book, and it could have been a different kind of a book about Britishness and Chineseness, but it's a very nuanced and wonderfully complex, knotty book that you have to sit with for a long time. And I think part of the reason that's the case is that Parisa was open to having those conversations with Sarah and having that friction and coming up with a book that's a process. process of that back and forth from editor to writer, rather than an editor kind of laying down their framework for what is good and you moving towards that. So yeah, I think I've been very fortunate in the editor that I have for my work, yeah.
Sure. You know, talking about foreign words, Nikesh, I haven't come across a single book in English that is as unapologetic of its use of Hindi and Gujarati words as yours is. I mean, you not only don't contextualize words, you also don't italicize them, which I thought was pretty fucking brave. Sorry. No, I remembered a number of fights I had with my editors about the profusion of Nepali words in my books. Could you tell us a bit about why you decided to do what you did? I mean, words like roti, dal, idli, desi are all not italicized. I mean, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like from the first draft, they weren't italicized, because I always find that the decision to italicize words that aren't English is quite arbitrary. So, you know, a word like samosa passes into colloquial whatever, and so people stop italicizing it. But then like uttapam, like, for me, they're you know, I eat them both a lot, you can tell. But so for me, like, uttapam was never italicized. It's not othered in that way. And I wanted, you know, the book is about sort of having a nuanced discussion about what Britishness means and what Britishness means when you bring so many different heritages and cultures into it. And you know, an American writer once said, and apologies for swearing again, but it was a good quote. They said, motherfuckers will read a book that's 1/3 in Elvish, but you put 2 sentences in Spanish and people think you're taking over. And I think there's something in that, because, and you know, the conversations I had with my editor about it, when my editor did want to translate like short bits of Swahili or what have you, was about, he wanted to ensure that contextually you could kind of get where I was going with it, and I was very much like, no. But we did the work to kind of meet halfway through. But where that decision comes from, I think says more about kind of like the gaze of like the publisher more than it does about the writer. And I was luckily working with a publisher who is very willing to kind of give me the space to kind of to treat these words as normalized as they are in my own world, you know.
Did you do the same thing with your previous books too? The italics and...
I don't think there... I mean, in Coconut Limited, there was... I played with it a bit, but I was kind of making fun of like linguistic differences a bit more. Whereas with this, I was kind of doing them justice and not making fun and not punching downwards as I was at times in my first novel.
So, Nikesh, let's talk a little bit about The Good Immigrant.
Sure.
So Nikesh edited, I'm sure a number of you have read the collection of essays. Nikesh edited this wonderful collection of essays from minority British writers, 21 of them, right? And I read in an interview that the reason you actually embarked on the project because you were sick and tired of the world saying that no one reads books written by minority writers. Could you tell us a bit about how the project came about and the reception it's gotten?
Yeah, so like a bunch of things happened in 2015. Like I sat on a few too many diversity panels that weren't going anywhere. I was having the same conversations I'd been having for years, and they were conversations that weren't new to the industry, or there were conversations that people before me had been having, and all it was basically asking for there to be more British writers of colour getting the opportunity to write books in back in 2010 to 2015, I must have read 4,000 books where like a middle-aged, middle-class white creative writing professor shags one of his impossibly attractive younger students and then is a bit sad for 400 pages. And I was just sick of reading those books or those books winning prizes. And I thought, well, what can I do? I can mouth off on Twitter, sure, but like, what else can I do? So I started putting the book together because, you know, just to give it a bit of context, like in 2016, you know, roughly like 165,000 new titles published in the UK, and out of those, 122 of them were by British writers of colour, and that includes self-published writers, and that includes cookery books as well. You know, recipe books are very diverse, and it's just not representative of the writers who are writing, of the landscape of what British culture looks like, especially in London, where all of publishing is. And whenever you ask the question, why aren't there more books being published by writers of colour, people say, people don't really read books by British writers of colour. And you just think, how do you know this? Where is your statistical data that proves you interviewed 100 people and 78 of them said, I will never read a book by a British writer of colour? No one would say that, but also... because people don't see colour, but also like you don't have that data, and I know anecdotally that people do want to read these books, and I you know, so I'm sick of the lack of work. I was sick of the lack of work being done to kind of find BAME audiences, and I was sick of people just flinging that out as an excuse when it means nothing and it's come from no analytical data. And also I was sick of my skin colour being treated like a marketing trend and being treated like a not very lucrative marketing trend, which was doubly insulting. But then so the book happened and it was a huge success, and you know, won awards, and you know, like essays from it went viral, and you know, it was a bestseller and all the rest of it. And it's been great, and it's spawned an American book and a journal and a literary agency for marginalised writers, and another top secret project that I can't really talk about, but you know, hopefully you'll see something on screens at some point. I don't know.
Fantastic.
But and maybe a podcast, you know, so loads of things spun out of it. But the main thing that spun out of it is that there's proof that people do read these books or do want these books. And, you know, the irony of ironies is that, like, in 2017, 2018, after we've had The Good Immigrant and Reniero Lodge's hugely successful book, and the success of Kayo's book and Black Panther and Moonlight and Dear White People on Netflix, and all of these like big cultural movements happening, people are now sitting in rooms going, wow, diversity really does sell. Diversity's so on trend right now. And you think, okay, great, but you're still treating it like a marketing trend and not like we're people. And that's the real shame of it all, really. But it's been a success, and that's been great.
When is The Good Immigrant America out?
January.
Oh, okay, excellent. You've also founded a literary prize for writers of color called the Jhalak Prize, and are in the process of founding a literary agency for minority writers.
Yeah, well, that's up and running now as well. So, you know, but you know, the funny thing about all of this stuff is like, I just want to write, like, you know, I just want to sit in my room or go on a 5-week writer's retreat and just write. But, you know, it kind of feels like at this point, there are so many writers who are doing activism as well as writing for the bare minimum standards of inclusion. And that to me seems like a real shame. And, you know, I think a lot about like, how many writers kind of get exhausted by doing all of the extra work around, you know, writing, where they're speaking out, they're burning bridges, they're ruining relationships, they're, you know, being branded as difficult, and all the rest of it, and you know, they lose careers over it. You know, I've been lucky, but you know, that I can think of a bunch of writers who no longer do anything because they were mouthy. And you just think of all the wasted talent in this country, because an industry like stands on the shoulders of Lionel Shriver saying, how dare people want bare, you know, basic, you know, her argument seems to be that representation and literary merit can't go hand in hand. Like, she can't bear, like, she doesn't seem to acknowledge the fact that people of colour can win award-winning books like Kumukanda or whatnot, and that to me is the real shame of it. Like, that's what you end up coming up against, and it's frustrating.
I've just been told that we need to wind this up and open the floor for questions. We have time for a few questions for Kayo, for Nikesh. Questions on writing, questions on race, questions on form, on anything you'd like. The lady there? Yeah.
Thank you both for very interesting talks. I'm just interested, Nikesh, is there any data on whether BME writers are read by BME people largely, or whether they're read by white people as well?
No, there's no data on any of it.
So when they talk about marketing trends and then it's good, like what is it bringing a new readership into reading, or is it existing readers diversifying what they're reading?
I mean, I can only speak anecdotally about like the readerships of like the Good Immigrant. Like non-fiction does do much better than fiction. That's just how it is. But
how many copies has the Good Immigrant sold, if I may ask?
Like nearly 100,000, I think.
Oh wow.
So yeah, anecdotally, what I could tell you is that lots of young people who didn't think that books were for them would come up to us at shows and say, "This is the first book I felt like I've wanted to read since I was forced to read books at school. So thank you for doing that." And so anecdotally, I can see that like there are reluctant readers out there who see themselves reflected and they then pick up a book. But I couldn't give any hard data on it. But that's the thing, like I don't have the hard data, and I'm not going to like do any because I'm not an analyst. You know, the publishing industry has said these things, but that's not based on any data. So someone like there's an organisation called the Reading Agency, and I'd love for them to do some data around this.
The gentleman there.
We talk quite a lot about kind of publishing industries and marketing and so forth, but I'm wondering what your experience of the reviewing culture in this country has been, and also perhaps how books actually come into bookshops, and what your experience of that has been. Review pages has been shrinking in newspapers. Writers of colour very rarely reviewed. There are other outlets, but what you see maybe some of the opportunities, particularly of online formats, perhaps around that, are.
I think in terms of, for example, I work I work on a literary periodical called The White Review, which it does publish some reviews, but we don't have the resources to publish loads of reviews, so we have to be selective in what we kind of review. But at the same time, because our reviews are sometimes published online, the audience for those is kind of wider than it might otherwise be. So because of that, we kind of choose very carefully books that maybe other people aren't reviewing as a way of kind of trying to shine a spotlight on those. But I guess what I notice about, and there's been a program set up by Sandeep Parmar and Sarah Howe called the Ledbury Emerging Critics program, which is for writers of colour who are critics, trying to kind of diversify that industry in terms of criticism in this country is a very kind of white male enterprise. If you look at the TLS, if you look at the LRB, if you look at The Guardian, all of those places, there's a kind of monopoly in terms of who writes for them and about what they write. So I guess in my own experience, I've been really lucky in terms of being reviewed a lot for a debut collection. But it's not even just, I think, race. There's also like a thing around what kind of a publisher you publish with. Because I publish with the publisher I publish with, there's a little bit more attention given to the stuff that I do. Whereas like, even for a company like Faber, them getting a review in The Guardian is more difficult than you'd think, even though Faber have this pedigree and history and whatever. So like, we can look at, say, Sophie Collins's poetry collection, Who is Mary Sue? Where's the review in The Guardian? Because like, it's whether you like it or you don't like the book is an event. Like, people have been waiting for the book. If you are into poetry, it's been a book that's been anticipated. So you'd expect it to be like a newsworthy thing. But yeah, so sometimes I feel like some of those outlets wait until something has happened with the book that makes it newsworthy in those terms, and I wish they would just review stuff because it's out, because somebody has come to them, to a commissioning editor, and been like, I'm really interested in writing about this book, what do you think? And then they commission it on that basis. I would love for that to be more the case, because then I think reviews would come out of a passion for a book, or a way of critiquing a book passionately as well, which would be more constructive, I think, than just... Because I think good criticism stands outside of mere marketing and goes into its own art form, and creates a context by which we read work. And I'd love for reviewing in this country to be more like that. The work is beginning to be done to make it so, but I think it's going to take a while.
Nikesh, would you like to add to that?
Only that I've seen places like Galdem and Burton Rotty and Media Diversified really sort of build these amazing, loyal audiences. And what's really nice about review culture is they're kind of doing the work and kind of finding audiences who might not necessarily go to them for book-related stuff, but kind of it gets validation through being on their site. And so that's always really exciting to see when they cover book-related stuff, because all three of those sites have amazing audiences.
There's a question back there. Sorry, I'll come to you after the woman in blue. B, yeah.
Thanks. I've got a friend that works in the United States who does, on the side, sensitization editing, where you're required by a publishing house or paid by a publishing house to sort of fill it out, white people's embarrassing racist inauthenticities, and she's getting increasingly vexed about doing this work for their credibility. And I just wondered what your take was on this as a publishing phenomenon.
I really feel like a news story has been invented around it, and I think by calling them sensitivity readers, it has created a thing. But people have been doing this stuff for years and years and years. Like, you write a novel where the main character's a doctor and you work for the council as your day job, you're going to go and chat to some doctors. Like, if you're from Bracknell and you're writing about someone who's from Newcastle, you might talk to some people from Newcastle. Like, it's all research and it's all part of the job. And I think that you know, I couldn't be a reader specifically for like cultural things, or for like, you know, if someone's writing about a Gujarati like from Northwest London, like I would, you know, I personally would find it hard to read that and sort of not see like project someone's opinion onto the text and what have you. But I feel like, you know, I feel like sensitivity readers are a really good thing, but I really don't like how it's been turned into this news story that they are ruining publishing, because they're not ruining publishing. They're doing the same job. They're doing a job that is adjacent to like the research you might do for like if you're interviewing a mountaineer or what have you. But what they're doing, I guess, is much more about weightier topics. So yeah,
It's the writer's job to get that right, isn't it?
I think where publishing is concerned, it's a kind of collaborative effort to bring the book to market. And so I don't know of many writers, like in my experience as an editor, who turn in like immaculate copy all the time, like immaculate in every sense, like every sentence, every word, absolutely everything is perfectly exact. And so there are people who copy edit, there are people who edit for other like things. And I think there's a certain sensitivity that someone should bring to the task of writing, which writers don't sometimes do. And that does bother me. I think that is the writer's job. If you're writing, for example, about somebody outside of your own subjectivity, you might have to ask, why am I doing this? And what can I bring to this? And if I'm going to do this, how am I going to do it properly? And so I agree with you there. That is the writer's job. But then I suppose if it's somebody outside your subjectivity, there's only so far that imagination can take you, or even research can take you. Sometimes you have to ask, is my rendering, does it ring true for you? Like, when you read it, does that feel right? Because sometimes what I feel about some things that have been brought to market is not so much, I don't feel particularly aggrieved that it's out there. I feel like, why wasn't anybody during this process consulted? Why did so many people in this process sign off on this thing? Like, it could have been avoided, this thing coming out into the world, if just they spoke to some people. So I think if people are going to be engaged in telling stories outside of their subjectivity, there's always going to be a need for those kinds of difficult conversation. I'm sorry, you've got this wrong, you need to rethink. I think that's a part of writing as much as you know, speaking from your own subjectivity and bringing something forward. Because I think there's a lot of mysticism around the writing process whereby we think of it as someone turning in something that's perfectly done and exactly right. And I don't know how true that can be. I think, you know, even some of our best writers had somebody in their process helping them to shape the book into the best thing they could be.
But I also just want to add to that and to your question, I do believe it's the writer's job, but sometimes writers are bullish when it comes to this stuff, and I often think that like what is termed as the sensitivity reader is often a publisher's intervention with the writer, but I often think it's deployed when a publisher feels like the writer hasn't done the work. And, you know, a good writer should do the work.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you. That was a fantastic question. Could the gentleman in the middle have a mic, please? I think we have time for one last question. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, firstly, thank you, Kayo and Nikesh, for bringing such a new and refreshing perspective about the world in the work you present, in the books you write, and the creativity that you bring to the fore. And one of the key things that I was thinking about was about being an artist and being a writer, and how difficult it is, and making that transition to take that big leap of faith and do this as a way of life. And I wanted to go back a little bit in your journey and to understand what your inspiration was and what the key challenge and turning point was for you to make that decision.
Kayo?
I think there was no single point of inspiration, but it was just that writing wasn't presented to me ever as something problematic. It was often presented as something perfectly kind of natural and valid, a valid way for me to spend my time, by teachers, by friends, by family. So while they didn't always understand my like compulsion to go away and write while other people were like socializing or whatever when I was growing up, they didn't also ostracize me for that. They were kind of just like, okay, well, you know, that's the thing that you enjoy. You carry on and do that. Here's some stuff you might enjoy reading. I heard something like this about this on the radio. Those kind of small bits of encouragement helped me to see it as something integrated into who I am. And so because of that, there was no kind of turning point in which I thought, okay, I'm going to pursue writing. It just gradually happened that writing became more and more the thing that I spent that kind of generative time on. And then in terms of, I think being involved in certain youth programs in poetry helped really crystallize that into the kind of stuff that I do now. So I worked with the Poetry Society when I was 16 through one of their programs, which is a poetry and performance program. And through that, I started to do readings publicly, and then that led to my wanting to publish the work in print, and everything has followed from that kind of first kind of meeting with a public face of poetry. So yeah, it's been that way since I was 16, something that's part of my life, and it doesn't seem ever that it won't be. So yeah, it was very gradual for me, I think.
Nikesh, we have 1 minute left.
Oh, God. Let me think. Let me take a really long pause. So, yeah, like Kayo, there wasn't like a single straight line. I remember finding Spider-Man comics as a child. They were the things that made me want to tell stories. And then I found the Buddha of Suburbia in the library once because I knew my parents wouldn't let me watch the TV version of it because it looked like there was lots of sex in it. But they couldn't stop me from reading, haha. Reading that book made me realise that my stories were valid too. And then I discovered rap, and I spent most of my 20s being like a very average rapper. I remember one of my last gigs was like as a rapper was one of Kayo's first gigs, like all those times ago. And that was like when I was thinking, well, maybe, I've always been writing. Writing has always been the constant, yeah. So it's been like a long journey for me, and I think it's been the thing that I did in addition to like having a job and working and all the rest of it. And it's only like in the last few months that I've been able to take the leap to being a writer, but being a full-time writer. But I've always been a writer, if you know what I mean. Like if you write, you're a writer. Whether you want to be a full-time writer, I would say being a full-time writer is hard because it means you have less face time with people, and people are the best sources of all your stories. And so that's been an interesting change I've had recently.
Thank you, Nikesh. On that note, we would have to end this. Thank you so much.